"They hurt my mama. She's dying." The words cut through the rumble of Harley engines like a knife through silk. Every conversation in the Iron Skulls clubhouse died mid-sentence. Pool cues froze. Beer bottles paused halfway to lips. The jukebox seemed to lower its volume out of respect for what was happening. Marcus "Viper" Stone looked down at the tiny hand clutching his leather vest. Blood stained the child's white dress. Tears carved clean paths through the dirt on her face. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, this little brown-skinned girl who had somehow found the courage to walk into the most dangerous biker clubhouse in Chicago and grab the sleeve of the most feared man in the room. What Viper did next would change everything. Comment where you're listening from. Subscribe to channel. The Iron Skulls clubhouse sat on the edge of Chicago's industrial district like a fortress made of chrome and attitude. It wasn't the kind of place where children appeared. Hell, it wasn't the kind of place where anyone appeared unless they had business with men who settled disputes with wrenches and fists, who lived by a code older than the law and twice as permanent. Marcus "Viper" Stone had ruled this kingdom for 15 years. At 53, he was a mountain of scarred muscle and road-worn leather. His arms told stories in ink, skulls and snakes, and the names of brothers who died on their bikes or in prison. His face was all hard angles and cold eyes, the kind of face that made grown men cross the street rather than risk making eye contact. But here's what nobody knew about Viper Stone. Mini cliffhanger. 30 years earlier, before the leather vest and the reputation, before the Iron Skulls and the fear, Marcus Stone had been a different man. He'd been Marcus Johnson, a mechanic at a small garage on the south side. He'd been married to a woman named Angela, who could make him laugh even when the rent was overdue. They'd been saving for a house, planning for kids, building something real in a neighborhood where real things were hard to keep. Then one night, a different motorcycle club, the Devil's Chosen, decided to send Marcus a message about refusing to sell them stolen parts. They didn't come for him at the garage. That would have been too direct, too honorable. Instead, they went to the apartment while Marcus was working late. Angela never had a chance. The police investigation went nowhere. Questions were asked that no one bothered to answer. And Marcus Johnson died that night, right alongside his wife. What crawled out of that grief wasn't a mechanic anymore. It was something harder, colder, meaner. It was Viper. He'd built the Iron Skulls from nothing. Ex-Marines, mechanics, men who'd been chewed up by life and spit out angry. They weren't a gang. They were a brotherhood. They had rules. You protected your own. You respected the neighborhood. You didn't hurt civilians. And you sure as hell didn't hurt women and children. For 3 decades, those rules had held firm. Viper Stone didn't show mercy to enemies, but he didn't create innocent victims either. He'd broken bones and burned bridges and sent more than a few men to the hospital, but every one of them had known what they were getting into. The walls around his heart had been built with motorcycle oil and prison concrete. Nobody got close. Nobody made him feel. Nobody reminded him of what he'd lost. Until Sophie Martinez burst through the clubhouse door. The child's grip tightened on Viper's vest. Her voice came out in broken sobs as she tried to explain what had happened. Around them, the Iron Skulls stood frozen, unsure how to process this unprecedented situation. These were men who'd faced down rival clubs and police raids without flinching. But none of them knew what to do with a terrified 7-year-old covered in her mother's blood. Through her tears, Sophie told them about the flower shop where her mama worked. About the apartment above it where they lived, just the two of them trying to make it in a neighborhood where making it was harder every day. About the men in red bandanas who came after closing time, demanding money her mother didn't have. "They yelled at her," Sophie whispered, her small voice shaking. "Said she was 3 months behind. Mama tried to explain about my medicine, about how I was sick last winter and we needed the money for the doctor. But they didn't care. They didn't care." Viper knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with the child. His brothers had seen him tower over men twice Sophie's size, had watched him break arms without changing expression. But now they watched something none of them had ever witnessed. Viper Stone making himself small, making himself safe for a scared little girl. "What's your name, kid?" His voice was surprisingly gentle, like gravel wrapped in velvet. Sophie Martinez." "Sophie, I need you to tell me exactly what these men looked like." "Can you do that?" She nodded, wiping her nose on her already ruined dress. "2 men. Young. They wore red bandanas with a snake on them. One had a scar right here." She traced a line down her left cheek. "The other one had a spider tattoo on his neck. They called each other Carlos and Miguel." Every biker in that clubhouse tensed. They knew those descriptions. Carlos Vega and Miguel Santos, enforcers for the Red Serpents, a gang that had been trying to muscle in on territory that had been neutral for over a decade. The Iron Skulls and the Serpents had an understanding. Stay out of each other's way. Don't mess with civilians. Keep the neighborhoods clean. But what they'd done tonight was different. What they'd done tonight was personal. This is when everything changed. Viper stood up slowly, his decision already made. "Bones," he called to his sergeant-at-arms, a former army medic with hands that could rebuild an engine or stitch a wound with equal skill. "Get the van. We're taking this girl and her mother to County General. Call ahead to Dr. Sarah Chen. Tell her it's priority." Dr. Chen was one of the city's best trauma surgeons, and she owed the Iron Skulls more than a few favors. They'd protected her clinic in a rough neighborhood when other gangs wanted to shut it down for refusing to deal pills. If anyone could save Sophie's mother, it would be her. "Hammer," Viper continued, addressing his vice president. "I want you to find Carlos Vega and Miguel Santos. Don't hurt them yet. Just bring them to the warehouse. I want to have a conversation about their business practices." Hammer smiled, cracking his knuckles. The sound echoed through the clubhouse like gunshots. "Consider it done, Prez." Viper looked around the room one more time, taking in the shocked faces of his brothers. He knew this moment would be talked about for years to come. The night Viper Stone showed mercy. The night the ice-cold biker let a little girl melt his heart. But he didn't care about any of that anymore. All he cared about was the small hand that slipped into his, Sophie's fingers barely wrapping around 2 of his. "Is my mama going to be okay?" she asked in a tiny voice. Viper squeezed her hand gently. "I'm going to make sure she is," he promised. And Viper Stone never made promises he couldn't keep. What happened next will shock you. The ride to the flower shop took 12 minutes through the crowded Chicago streets. Viper rode his '84 Harley Softail with Sophie clinging to his back, her small arms wrapped around his waist. Behind them, a convoy of Iron Skulls followed. 5 more bikes and Bones driving the van with Dr. Chen's medical equipment already loaded. The roar of the engines cut through the night like thunder. People on the sidewalks stopped and stared. Some crossed themselves. Others pulled their children close. The Iron Skulls rolling deep through the south side meant something was happening, and smart people got out of the way. Sophie's grip tightened every time Viper accelerated, but she didn't cry anymore. Maybe it was the rumble of the engine beneath her, steady and powerful. Maybe it was the leather-clad giants surrounding them on all sides, a wall of chrome and fury protecting her. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe for the first time in hours, she felt safe. As they pulled up to Elena's flowers, Viper could see the devastation immediately. The front window had been smashed. Flowers and plants lay scattered across the sidewalk, their petals crushed underfoot. The sign that had once proudly displayed the shop's name hung crooked and damaged, the painted letters cracked like broken promises. But Viper's attention was focused on what lay inside. Elena Martinez lay crumpled behind the counter, her dark hair fanned across the wooden floor like spilled ink. Blood pooled beneath her head. Her breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps that Viper recognized from too many bar fights and back alley beatings. The sound of someone fading fast. Dr. Chen rushed past them, her medical bag already open. She knelt beside Elena, her practiced hands moving quickly to assess the injuries. "Severe head trauma," she muttered, checking the pulse. "Possible internal bleeding. We need to move her now." Sophie stood frozen in the doorway, her small frame trembling as she took in the destruction of everything she knew. Her home, her mother's life's work. All of it lay in ruins around them, and for a moment the little girl who'd been so brave, who'd walked 12 blocks through hell to find help, looked like she might shatter completely. "Sophie, listen to me." Viper crouched down to meet her eyes. "The doctor is going to take care of your mama, but I need you to stay strong for her, okay? Can you do that?" The little girl nodded, though tears continued to stream down her cheeks. "Will she remember me when she wakes up?" The question hit Viper harder than any punch ever had. He thought of Angela, of all the things left unsaid, all the moments stolen by violence. "She'll remember," he said firmly, "and she'll be so proud of how brave you were tonight." His phone buzzed, an old Nokia brick that felt like a weapon in his scarred hands. Hammer's voice came through, crisp and efficient. "Prez, we found them. Carlos and Miguel were at a bar on Ashland, bragging about their work tonight. They're secured at the warehouse." Viper's jaw tightened. The rage that had been simmering beneath his protective instincts began to surface, hot and familiar. These weren't just random criminals anymore. They were the men who had put a 7-year-old girl through hell. They were the reason Elena Martinez might never see another sunrise. "Good," Viper replied, his voice deadly calm. "I'll be there after I get Sophie settled." But there was one thing he didn't know. Mini cliffhanger. The ride to County General passed in a blur of sirens and Sophie's whispered prayers. Viper found himself holding the little girl's hand as she spoke to her unconscious mother, telling her about the nice biker man who was going to help them, promising to be good if she would just wake up. Just please wake up. At the hospital, Dr. Chen disappeared into surgery while Viper made arrangements. Sophie would stay in a private room adjacent to her mother's. Round-the-clock security, 2 iron skulls in the hallway at all times, the best pediatric care available. Money was no object when it came to keeping this child safe. As Viper tucked Sophie into the hospital bed, the little girl clutching a stuffed bear one of the nurses had brought her, he knew his night was far from over. Exhaustion finally claimed her small body, her eyes fluttering closed mid-sentence about butterflies and chocolate ice cream. She looked so peaceful, so innocent, so different from the broken, desperate child who had stumbled into his clubhouse hours earlier. Viper stepped into the hallway and pulled out his phone. "Bones, bring my bike around. It's time to visit our guests." The warehouse on 5th Street was one of the Iron Skull's more discreet properties. No neighbors to hear sounds, no windows for light to escape, just thick concrete walls and the kind of privacy that allowed for serious conversations. Carlos Vega and Miguel Santos sat tied to chairs in the center of the empty space. Their earlier bravado had been replaced by the kind of fear that came with recognizing your situation had gone from bad to catastrophic. Both men were young, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of swagger that came from thinking violence made you untouchable. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Viper entered the warehouse slowly, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. He'd changed from his riding vest into his colors, the full leather vest with the iron skulls patches that told anyone who could read them exactly how dangerous this man was. Behind him, Hammer and 3 other brothers took positions by the door. "Gentlemen," Viper said, his voice conversational, "I understand you had a busy evening." Carlos, the one with the scar, tried to maintain his defiance. "Look, man, whatever this is about, we can work something out. You know how it is in our business." Viper walked a slow circle around the 2 chairs, studying his captives like specimens under a microscope. "Our business," he repeated. "Tell me, Carlos, what business do you think beating unconscious mothers in front of their children falls under?" The color drained from Carlos's face. Miguel, the one with the spider tattoo, began to sweat visibly. They were starting to understand that this wasn't about territory or money or any of the usual reasons men in their line of work found themselves in situations like this. "The woman was holding out on us," Miguel stammered. "She owed protection money. We had to make an example." Viper stopped walking. The temperature in the warehouse seemed to drop 10 degrees. That was his biggest mistake. "An example?" Viper repeated softly. Repeated. "What example did you think you were making when you traumatized a 7-year-old girl?" Neither man answered. They couldn't, because there was no answer that would save them now. Viper reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph. It was a crayon drawing Sophie had made while waiting at the hospital, a simple sketch of her mother surrounded by flowers. The little girl had given it to him, asking him to keep it safe until her mama could see it. "This is Sophie Martinez," Viper said, holding up the drawing. 7 years old, loves butterflies and chocolate ice cream, dreams of becoming a teacher so she can help other children learn to read. Tonight, she watched 2 grown men beat her mother unconscious over $67. He set the drawing on a nearby table where both men could see it. 67, he repeated. That's what Elena Martinez had in her register. Barely enough to cover tomorrow's grocery run, and you 2 thought it was worth putting a child through hell to take it. Carlos made one last desperate attempt at negotiation. "Look, Mr. Stone, we didn't know the kid was there. If we had known..." "If you had known what?" Viper's voice cut through the excuse like a blade. "If you had known, you would have beaten her too? Made sure there were no witnesses to your heroic victory over a single mother trying to make an honest living?" Let me tell you who Carlos Vega and Miguel Santos really were. They weren't soldiers. They weren't warriors. They were bullies who'd found a gang that would pay them to terrorize people weaker than themselves. They were exactly the kind of men Viper had spent 30 years making sure stayed out of his territory. Viper walked to the table where his brothers had laid out various tools. Not weapons exactly, but implements that could become very persuasive in the right hands. He selected a heavy chain, testing its weight thoughtfully. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his tone remaining conversational despite the deadly intent behind his words. "You're going to tell me exactly how much money your little gang has made from terrorizing shop owners in Elena's neighborhood. Every dollar, every cent. And then you're going to help me figure out how to make sure it gets distributed back to the people you've been bleeding dry." Miguel's voice cracked as he spoke. "We don't have that kind of authority. The money goes up the chain. We just collect." Viper nodded, as if this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. "Then it sounds like I need to have a conversation with your boss as well. What's his name?" "Razor Rodriguez," Carlos whispered. "But you can't touch him. He's got connections. Protection." Viper actually smiled at this, though there was no warmth in the expression. "Protection?" he mused. "You mean like the protection you offered Elena Martinez? The kind that involves unconscious mothers and traumatized children?" He set the chain back on the table and picked up his phone instead. Hammer, I want you to arrange a meeting with this Razor Rodriguez. Tonight, if possible. Let him know that Viper Stone would like to discuss his organization's customer service practices. As Hammer made the call, Viper turned back to his captives. You see, gentlemen, I've been in this life for a very long time. I've made my share of enemies, taken my share of territory, collected my share of debts. But there are lines even men like us don't cross. And tonight, you crossed every single one of them. The truth they buried for 30 years was about to surface. The warehouse fell silent except for the sound of Miguel quietly sobbing. Carlos stared at the little girl's drawing on the table, perhaps finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what they had done. Viper's phone rang. It was Dr. Chen calling from the hospital. How is she? Viper answered immediately. Touch and go, the doctor replied. The next few hours will be critical, but she's a fighter. The surgery went better than expected. Viper felt a weight lift from his chest that he hadn't even realized was there. And Sophie? Sleeping peacefully. She asked the nurses to tell you thank you for keeping your promise. After ending the call, Viper looked at Carlos and Miguel with something approaching pity. Elena Martinez is going to live, he told them. Which means you two just graduated from attempted murder to aggravated assault. Congratulations. He walked toward the door, then paused and looked back. I want you to think very carefully about the choices you've made tonight. About the little girl who will have nightmares for months because of your actions. About the woman who will never feel completely safe in her own shop again. And then I want you to think about what kind of men you want to be when this is all over. What Viper did next would destroy everything. Viper left them there to contemplate their situation while he went to prepare for his meeting with Razor Rodriguez. The night was far from finished, but something fundamental had shifted in his world. For the first time in 30 years, he was fighting for something more than territory or respect or fear. He was fighting for the same thing that 7-year-old girl had fought for when she burst into his clubhouse and grabbed his vest. He was fighting for family. The meeting with Razor Rodriguez was set for 2 a.m. at an abandoned auto shop on the industrial side of town. Viper arrived with Hammer and 5 other iron skulls, their Harleys cutting through the empty streets like chrome bullets fired from the barrel of the night. The air was thick with the scent of motor oil and rust, a fitting backdrop for the kind of conversation that was about to unfold. Razor had brought his own crew, 6 men who tried to look intimidating, but couldn't quite hide the nervousness in their eyes when Viper stepped off his bike. Word traveled fast in their world, and by now everyone knew that Viper Stone had personally involved himself in what should have been a minor neighborhood dispute. Razor Rodriguez was younger than Viper had expected, maybe 35, with gold teeth and enough jewelry to stock a small pawn shop. He carried himself with the kind of artificial confidence that came from never having faced real consequences for his actions. Viper recognized the type immediately. All flash, no substance. The kind of leader who sent others to do his dirty work while he counted money and made threats from a safe distance. Mr. Stone, Razor said, extending a hand that Viper ignored entirely. This is unexpected. I heard you Iron Skulls don't usually get involved in street-level business anymore. Viper's silence stretched long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. He studied Razor with the same intensity he might use to examine a particularly venomous snake, cataloging weaknesses, measuring threats, calculating exactly how much pressure it would take to break this man's carefully constructed image. Street-level business, Viper repeated finally, his voice carrying across the empty garage like distant thunder. Is that what you call terrorizing mothers and traumatizing children? Razor's smile faltered slightly, but he tried to maintain his swagger. Look, business is business. Sometimes people need reminders about their obligations. Your boys, Viper interrupted, Put a 7-year-old girl through hell tonight. They beat her mother unconscious over 67 melatones. $67, Rodriguez. The temperature in the garage seemed to drop. The iron skulls had positioned themselves strategically around the space, and Razor's crew was beginning to realize that this meeting might not end with the usual handshake and territorial agreement they had expected. Here's what they didn't want you to know. The woman was behind on her payments, Razor said, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. 3 months behind. We gave her plenty of warnings. Viper took a step closer, and despite being surrounded by his own men, Razor instinctively backed away. There was something in Viper's eyes that spoke of violence older and deeper than anything Razor had ever encountered, a kind of controlled fury that made the young gang leader's petty brutalities look like children playing at being monsters. 3 months, Viper said thoughtfully. Tell me, Rodriguez, do you know what Elena Martinez does for a living? She runs some flower shop, Razor replied, confusion evident in his voice. She runs a flower shop that barely makes enough to cover rent and groceries. She works 16-hour days arranging bouquets for weddings she'll never afford to have, funeral wreaths for people she's never met, Valentine's arrangements for lovers who have what she lost when her husband died in a construction accident 3 years ago. Viper's voice remained steady, but there was something building beneath the calm surface, like pressure in a boiler that was approaching its breaking point. She's been behind on your blood money because she spent her last savings on medicine for Sophie when the girl had pneumonia last winter. She chose her daughter's life over your protection racket, and somehow you thought that made her fair game for your animals. Razor tried to interrupt, but Viper continued as if he hadn't spoken. Do you know what that little girl did tonight, Rodriguez? After she watched your men beat her mother unconscious, after she saw everything she knew destroyed. She didn't call the police. She didn't run to neighbors. She walked 12 blocks through the worst part of the city. A 7-year-old girl, alone in the dark, to find someone who could help. Viper pulled out Sophie's crayon drawing again, holding it up so everyone in the garage could see it. This is what courage looks like, Rodriguez. This is what real strength is. A child who refuses to give up on the person she loves most in the world. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Razor's men seemed uncomfortable now, shifting from foot to foot, avoiding eye contact. Viper folded the drawing carefully and placed it back in his jacket, right over his heart. This is when everything changed. So here's what's going to happen, Viper said, his tone shifting from philosophical to purely business. You're going to liquidate your entire operation in Elena's neighborhood. Every protection payment, every debt, every outstanding balance. It all disappears tonight. Razor's artificial bravado flared back to life. You can't just come in here and... I'm not done talking, Viper said quietly, and the younger man's mouth snapped shut. You're going to take whatever money you've collected from that neighborhood over the past year, and you're going to distribute it back to every shop owner, every family, every person you've been bleeding dry. That's impossible, Razor protested. We don't have that kind of cash on hand, and even if we did... Then you'll find it, Viper replied. Sell your cars, your jewelry, your mother's china if you have to. Rob your own dealers for all I care. But those people are getting their money back. Viper walked closer until he was standing directly in front of Razor, close enough that the younger man had to crane his neck to maintain eye contact. And if I hear about any of your people operating within 10 blocks of Elena's flower shop ever again, if so much as one of your boys jaywalks in her neighborhood, I will personally introduce you to the kind of consequences your parents should have taught you about years ago. Let me ask you something. Have you ever watched someone with power choose to use it for good instead of profit? Have you seen what happens when a man who's built his life on being untouchable decides that protecting one child matters more than maintaining his reputation? Drop your story in the comments. Razor opened his mouth to argue, but one look at Viper's face, at the cold certainty in those road-worn eyes, told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't even really a conversation. It was Viper Stone telling him exactly how things were going to be, and the only choice Razor had was whether he wanted to walk away from this garage on his own 2 feet or in a body bag. "We understand each other?" Viper asked, his voice deceptively calm. Razor nodded, his gold teeth no longer gleaming quite so bright. "Good. You have 48 hours to start making this right. My brothers will be checking in to make sure you're keeping your word. And Rodriguez?" Viper leaned in close enough that only Razor could hear his next words. "If you even think about retaliating against Elena or Sophie, if you so much as send one of your boys to drive past that flower shop, I will find you. And what happened to the Devil's Chosen 30 years ago will look like a mercy compared to what I'll do to the Red Serpents." The color drained from Razor's face. Everyone in the life knew the story of the Devil's Chosen. How they'd been the most powerful motorcycle club in Chicago until they crossed a line with a mechanic's wife. How they'd vanished overnight, their clubhouse burned to the ground, their members scattered to the wind or buried in unmarked graves. No one had ever proven who was responsible, but everyone had their suspicions. What happened next will shock you. Viper turned and walked back to his bike, his brothers falling into formation around him. The Harleys roared to life in perfect synchronization, a wall of sound that shook the garage's corrugated metal walls. As they rode back into the night, Hammer pulled up alongside Viper at a red light. "You think he'll actually do it, Prez? Give the money back?" Viper glanced at his vice president. "He'll do it, and if he doesn't, we'll make sure he regrets it for however long he has left." "What changed, Viper?" Hammer asked. "In all the years I've known you, I've never seen you get personally involved in something like this. We protect our territory, sure, but this is different." Viper was quiet for a long moment, the rumble of his Harley filling the silence between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible over the engine. 30 years ago, I lost everything because I couldn't protect the person I loved most. Tonight, I got a chance to make sure that doesn't happen to someone else. That little girl walked 12 blocks through hell because she believed someone would help her. I'll be damned if I'm going to prove her wrong." The light turned green. The iron skulls rolled forward into the night, chrome glinting under the streetlights like armor forged from moonlight and diesel fuel. 6 months later, Elena Martinez stood behind the counter of her rebuilt flower shop, watching through sparkling new windows as her daughter Sophie played in the small garden that the iron skulls had installed behind the building. The Red Serpents had vanished from the neighborhood entirely, their former territories now under the quiet protection of men who understood the difference between power and bullying. Every shop owner who'd been extorted had received their money back, delivered in plain envelopes by men on Harleys who refused to give their names. Viper still visited every Tuesday, not as the feared president of the Iron Skulls, but as the man who had chosen to let a little girl's courage crack open his heart. Elena would prepare fresh coffee, the good stuff from the shop down the street, not the cheap diner brew. Sophie would show him her latest drawings, usually featuring motorcycles and flowers in equal measure. And for a few precious hours, the three of them would sit together like the family none of them had dared to dream possible. The city whispered about the night Viper Stone saved a child and found his soul. Stories spread through the neighborhoods about the biker who'd gone to war over $67 and a little girl's tears. The Iron Skull's reputation changed. They were still feared, still powerful, still not to be crossed. But now there was something else in the fear. Respect. The kind that came from knowing these men had lines they wouldn't cross and principles they would die to defend. But Sophie knew the truth that the adults had missed entirely. She hadn't saved her mother by finding the most dangerous biker in Chicago. She had saved him by showing him that even the hardest heart could choose love over fear. On a Tuesday evening in early spring, Viper sat at Elena's kitchen table, helping Sophie with her homework while Elena prepared dinner. The smells of home-cooked food filled the apartment, rice and beans and the kind of meal that Viper hadn't experienced since Angela was alive. "Viper?" Sophie looked up from her math worksheet, her pencil hovering over the numbers. "Yeah, kid? Why did you help us that night? Mama says most people wouldn't have." Viper set down his own coffee cup, considering the question. How did you explain 30 years of grief and rage to a 7-year-old? How did you tell her that she'd reminded you of the children you never got to have, the family that was stolen before it could begin? "Because sometimes," he said carefully, "the bravest thing you can do is ask for help. And sometimes, the people who look the scariest are the ones who understand what it's like to be scared." Sophie tilted her head, processing this. "Were you scared that night?" "Terrified," Viper admitted. "Not of the red serpents or the fight. I was scared that I wouldn't be able to keep the promise I made you, that your mama wouldn't wake up, that I'd fail you the way I failed someone else a long time ago." "But you didn't fail," Sophie said simply. "You saved her. You saved us." Elena appeared in the doorway, tears in her eyes. She'd heard the conversation, heard the vulnerability in Viper's voice that he rarely showed to anyone. "You saved all of us," she said softly, "including yourself." For the first time in 30 years, Marcus Viper Stone felt like he might be home. But the story doesn't end there, because 6 months after that Tuesday dinner, Razor Rodriguez made a mistake. He thought enough time had passed, thought Viper had forgotten or moved on, thought he could send one of his boys, just one, just to scope out the neighborhood, just to see if maybe, possibly, things had cooled down enough to move back in. That was his second mistake. The first was crossing Viper in the first place. Hammer spotted the Red Serpent Scout before he'd made it 3 blocks into Elena's neighborhood. One phone call later, the Iron Skulls were rolling 20 deep through the south side, a wall of chrome and leather and righteous fury. They found Razor at his usual spot, a bar on the west side where he held court like some kind of discount kingpin. The look on his face when Viper walked through the door, flanked by Hammer and Bones and 18 other brothers whose colors told the story of exactly how serious this was almost worth the ride over. "Mr. Stone," Razor stammered, his gold teeth clicking together nervously. "This is unexpected. I can explain—" "You can't," Viper interrupted, "because there's no explanation for breaking your word. There's no excuse for testing me, and there's damn sure no forgiveness for threatening my family." "Your family?" Razor looked confused. "I didn't. Elena and Sophie are under my protection. That makes them family. And family is the line you don't cross." What Viper did next became the stuff of legend in Chicago's underground. Not because of violence, though there was some of that. Not because of threats, though there were plenty. But because of what Viper made Razor do. He made him apologize. Not to Viper. Not to the Iron Skulls. But to Elena Martinez and her daughter Sophie in person, in front of his entire crew and half the South Side. Razor Rodriguez, leader of the Red Serpents, had to get down on his knees in Elena's flower shop and tell a 7-year-old girl that he was sorry for what his men had done to her mother. Had to admit that he was wrong, that his gang was wrong, that the whole protection racket system was built on bullying people who couldn't fight back. And then Viper made him leave Chicago entirely, gave him 72 hours to liquidate his operations, distribute whatever assets remained to the shop owners he'd victimized, and disappear. The Red Serpents could go to Milwaukee, St. Louis, Detroit, anywhere but Chicago. "But this is my city," Razor protested weakly. "Not anymore," Viper replied. "Now it's Sophie's city, and Elena's, and every other person who's just trying to make an honest living without being terrorized by parasites like you." 72 hours later, The red serpents were gone. The Iron Skull's reputation spread beyond Chicago after that. Other motorcycle clubs, other gangs, other organizations that operated in the gray areas of the law. They all heard the story of Viper Stone and the little girl who changed everything. Some laughed, called him soft, said sentiment was weakness and Viper had lost his edge. But the smart ones, the ones who'd been in the life long enough to understand how it really worked, they recognized what had actually happened. Viper hadn't gotten soft. He'd gotten focused. Because here's what they didn't want you to know about men like Marcus Viper Stone. The truly dangerous ones aren't the ones who have nothing to lose. They're the ones who found something worth protecting. A man with nothing to lose will burn the world down out of spite. But a man with something to protect? That man will burn the world down with purpose, with planning, with the kind of cold, calculated fury that comes from knowing exactly what he's fighting for. And Viper Stone had found his purpose in a 7-year-old girl's courage and a single mother's resilience. The Iron Skull's territory expanded over the next few years, but not through violence or intimidation. They expanded through protection, real protection, not the kind that came with threats and beatings. Shop owners paid them, yes, but the payments were fair and the protection was genuine. Drugs stayed out of their neighborhoods. Violence against civilians became unthinkable. And anyone who tried to move in with the old ways found themselves facing not just the Iron Skulls, but entire communities willing to stand up and fight back. Because Viper had shown them something they'd forgotten. That power used to protect was stronger than power used to terrorize. 10 years after that cold Tuesday night, Sophie Martinez graduated from high school at the top of her class. She'd been accepted to Northwestern on a full academic scholarship, planning to study education just like she'd always dreamed. Viper sat in the audience with Elena, both of them beaming with pride as Sophie crossed the stage. She'd grown into a beautiful, confident young woman who spoke 3 languages, tutored kids in her neighborhood, and had already been offered teaching positions before she'd even started college. In her valedictorian speech, Sophie talked about courage, not the kind that came from being unafraid, but the kind that came from being terrified and choosing to act anyway. "When I was 7 years old," she told the packed auditorium, "my mother was dying and I had to make a choice. I could hide and hope someone else would help, or I could go find help myself. I walked 12 blocks through some of the most dangerous neighborhoods in Chicago, and I walked into a place most people wouldn't dare to enter. And I found that sometimes the people who look the most dangerous are the ones with the biggest hearts." She looked directly at Viper when she said it, and he felt his eyes getting suspiciously moist behind his sunglasses. "That night taught me that courage isn't about being the strongest or the toughest. It's about being willing to be vulnerable enough to ask for help when you need it. And it taught me that real strength comes from using your power to protect people who can't protect themselves." The audience erupted in applause. But Viper barely heard it. He was thinking about Angela, about the man he'd been before that night 40 years ago, when violence had stolen everything from him, about the walls he'd built, and the years he'd spent alone because he thought sentiment was weakness. Sophie had proven him wrong. She'd shown him that opening your heart was the bravest thing you could do. After the ceremony, Sophie found Viper in the parking lot, sitting on his Harley and staring at the sunset. She'd changed out of her graduation gown into jeans and a leather jacket, a gift from the Iron Skulls for her 18th birthday. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what, kid?" "For being brave enough to help a scared little girl, for showing me that family isn't just about blood, for proving that people can change." Viper pulled her into a hug, this girl who'd become as much his daughter as if they'd shared DNA. "Thank you," he said, "for reminding an old biker that he still had a heart worth using." So let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you needed help but were afraid to ask? Have you ever looked at someone and judged them based on how they looked, only to discover they had more compassion than people who seemed safer? Sophie Martinez was 7 years old when she walked into a biker clubhouse covered in her mother's blood and grabbed the sleeve of the most dangerous man in Chicago. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have backup. She just had courage and the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, would choose to care. And Viperstone was a 53-year-old biker who'd spent 30 years building walls around his heart, convinced that caring was weakness and attachment was a liability. He'd survived in a brutal world by being harder, colder, meaner than everyone else. Until a little girl's tears reminded him of what he'd lost and showed him what he could still save. The truth they buried in chrome and leather wasn't about gang violence or protection rackets or turf wars. It was simpler and more powerful than that. It was about the fact that sometimes the smallest hands carry the greatest power to change everything. Because Sophie didn't just save her mother that night. She saved Marcus Viper Stone from becoming the kind of man who'd forgotten why power mattered in the first place. Share this story. Not the sanitized version where bikers are just misunderstood rebels, or where one good deed erases decades of questionable choices. Share the real version. The one where a child's courage intersected with a broken man's buried humanity and created something neither of them expected. Share it because somewhere right now, there's another Sophie walking through dangerous streets looking for help. And somewhere, there's another Viper sitting in his fortress of chrome and leather, convinced his heart died years ago. And maybe, just maybe, this story will help them find each other before it's too late. Because here's what the Red Serpents never understood, what Razor Rodriguez learned too late, and what the Iron Skulls proved every day for the next 20 years. Real power isn't about how much fear you can inspire. It's about how much love you can protect. And the most dangerous man in the room is never the one with the biggest gun or the meanest reputation. It's the one who's found something worth fighting for. Drop your story in the comments. Tell me about the time someone surprised you with their kindness. Tell me about the moment you chose to ask for help, even though you were terrified. Tell me about the person who looked dangerous but turned out to have the biggest heart. Because those stories matter. They remind us that humanity exists in the darkest places. That courage can crack even the hardest exterior. That sometimes the smallest gesture of trust can change everything. Subscribe to channel for more true stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the face of impossible odds. And remember, the next time you see someone who looks dangerous, consider that they might just be someone who's learned to protect themselves from a world that hurt them. They might be waiting for someone brave enough to show them it's safe to care again. That someone could be you. Stay just, stay loud, stay free. And never underestimate the power of a child's courage to change the world.